Happy Sunday. My name is Robert. We will get started momentarily. We're just wrapping up a few administrative things, so bear with us for 1 second, taking a little bit longer than normal. And looks like everything is working fine. Hopefully everyone's doing well. I was just chatting with Ed. Can you believe it's almost Labor Day weekend? Pretty amazing that we've gotten to that point in the summer, but it is what it is. So let's continue on. Let's see. Ed, I previously muted you when you stepped away, so you'll need to unmute yourself. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Robert. This is the 5th Enslaved series we've had, and this particular program is going to focus on Black resistance, and it's going to be hosted by my friend Edward of Georgetown University. So we're really excited about that. Before I turn things over to Ed, let's go through a few housekeeping type items. For Zoom, if you're watching on Zoom as opposed to watching a recording or on Facebook Live, we don't do a Zoom demonstration, but just real quick, there's usually only a few things that people ever have questions with. One is the sound. So everyone except Edward and myself will be listen only mode or muted. If you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides that we're showing take up the full screen. If that's not currently happening because you see these black boxes that have my name and Edward's name on them, you can make those go away at your end by clicking on either view or view options, which is usually up at the top of a person's screen or session, and you can click off the side-by-side mode. Throughout our program, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, perspectives, opinions, memories, etc., feel free to share those with us in the chat or the Q&A. Just as a reminder for this program, you won't be able to see, other people won't be able to see your questions and comments until they're approved by the host. We do that to prevent Zoom bombers. And for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. And we always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or on the Facebook comments, if you're watching on Facebook, we always welcome people to introduce themselves. You can tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and what are you looking forward to this fall? So for myself, my name is Robert. I currently split my time between Austin, Texas, where I'm joining you from at the moment, and Washington, D.C. And what I'm looking forward to this fall is spending time with my family and maybe even going to the beach if COVID continues to stay under control, but we'll see what happens. And my name is Robert. I'm the founder and the director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And today I'm joined by my friend Edward of Georgetown University. And this is one of a series of programs that he's done. If you have not seen the previous programs, I'll post the links for the recordings of them in the chat in Zoom or in the comments on Facebook in just a second. But just to recap, the previous programs we did were Enslaved, Washington, D.C., 1790 to 2021. That was the first one. Next in the series was Empire of Blood, Europe from 1454 to 1807. Then we did Slaver Nation, 1495 to Jim Crow. And the last one from a couple months ago was Slavery and the U.S. Economy. But today we're going to be talking about, oh, and just as a reminder, you can find all those programs on YouTube. I'll paste the links to those in the chat in Zoom and then also the comments on Facebook. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Edward. So Ed, you want to take it away? It's all yours. And Ed's program is about a couple hours approximately, so a little bit longer. If you need to take a break at any point in time, feel free to do so. Ed will keep us on the edge of our seats that whole time. And again, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, opinions, memories, etc., feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A. Ed, it's all yours. Take it away. Oh, Ed, and you're still on mute because I muted you earlier. Sorry about that.
Hi, Robert. Hi,
Oh,
everybody.
there you go. I can see your presentation loud and clear.
Okay, Robert, are we ready to, shall I just launch? Can I go?
Yep, all set, all yours.
All right. Folks, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where everyone is. My name is Ed Ingebretsen, and I have one quick announcement. My husband left me with childcare, so there may be a little bit of commotion in the background on occasion. Please bear with these four-legged sentient creatures who want my attention, but they need to learn this material as well. I appreciate everyone's interest and ethics in being here on a Sunday morning like this to spend some time with a topic that is going to get demonstrably more difficult than it even sounds, because I'm going to take issue with the way, how do we say, I'm speaking now from my teaching at Georgetown in terms of teaching literature and teaching genre, and how basically how news works and how we only listen to certain stories, sorry, that we have already heard. And I'm taking a moment this morning to acknowledge 61 years ago, the death of Emmett Till on the left. And on this date, or at least yesterday's date, Dr. Martin Luther King's largely extemporaneous speech, I Have a Dream, on the 100-year anniversary of emancipation. If I have a dedication at all, that's what this is. Rise, a verb. Move from a lower position to a higher one. Come or go up. 2, get up from lying, sitting, or kneeling. One slave stated that Vesey said that the Negroes were living such an abominable life, they ought to rise. And when there is the possibility of a storm, if you want change in your life, walk into it. If you get on the other side, you will be different. If you want change in your life and you're avoiding the trouble, you can forget it. Wade on in the water, it's going to be really troubled water. So Harriet would say. It's Harriet Tubman. She knows her Bible. The troubled waters, of course, the expression in the first book of Genesis. So the problems with telling a story, and I beg to spend some time here at the beginning. It's going to sound like a lecture in terms of how we read history and how we read news, and I think it's worth it. I think it's good to pay attention to the material that gets into our heads and how we get it there and what we do with it. But the problems with telling a story is that narration is never outside of history. And this is a quote from a book on the Caribbean. The denunciation of slavery in a presentist mode is easy. To condemn slavery alone is the easy way out. What needs to be denounced here to restore authenticity is much less in slavery than the racist present within which representations of slavery are produced. A presentist model, that's you and me and Robert and all of us speaking across the globe from wherever we are, talking about materials that we have safely encapsulated as historical, beyond, not us. But so listening to stories, it gets even more complicated. And this is what I want to do in this presentation, and I will repeat these points because sometimes they're new to some ways of thinking. I'm going to query the genre of the resistance narrative, the revolt narrative, for its Eurocentric pleasure. That is to say, it's a European model, like Gothic, like romance. We grow up with these materials. We go to school with them. We're given exams on how to do literary analysis, and we talk about this Gothic novel, that romantic novel, humanism and benevolism. It's designed for white readers. I'll just lay it right out there. Because at the time, through this particular period, these Eurocentric genres, really, they were designed for white men because they were the ones who had the ability to read. 2, my presentation argues that narratives of slave continues a prime social effect of legal enslavement. That is to say, enslavement in narrative is a continued form of race dominance, and we'll talk about these. And that fact, number three, can be seen when we start comparing, quote, the numbers of, quote, rebellions. And rebellion is a word I'm questioning all the way through this because there's a legal basis to it and there's none technically exists. So rebellion, quote, pre-1865 versus, quote, race unrest post-1865. Just as we begin to look at some of the representations, you'll hear rebellion before 1865, race unrest 1865. And race unrest both hides the person's involved, it's like the passive voice, is telling a lie or not telling the truth. And it argues that since 1860, an evident but not addressed increase in what I'm now calling social distress obliquely addresses the social divide of power. And again, I apologize that all this is very heady and we should have 9 weeks to work it through, but when we see the term race unrest or race after 1865, even as late as 2021, we'll find it exchanged for, quote, slave in these narratives. It's a distraction from the real topic. It's a blind. It's a reinscription of a dynamic of power without saying the words that made it possible. So my conclusion, all the way through all of this, and I will give us 2 hours and be done by 1. Narratives of violence, and they're more broad than just this, of course. Cultural narratives of violence are a kind of grammar. They're about pleasure, they're really pleasure. They're not about history. Locating them in the past, these sorts of, quote, rebellion narratives, when we locate them in the past, it exploits some pleasure, we don't know yet what, without any responsibility for the present. Taking a picture, emphasis on take. The captivity of narrative. The eye of the camera is white. I'll just lay that out there. The eye of the narrator is white. These are the tools of colonialism. This goes back to a conversation I had in class when they were about our homework. My question, so what did you think about Hegel's essay, The Master-Slave Dialectic, 1807, and you wonder why he picked that particular title? Answer, students, it was hard. Question, what did you think about the film, 12 Years a Slave? Answer, we liked it. Emphasis theirs. So what I will be dressing throughout here, without spending a lot of time on it, is the disjunction between what we call in school scopic pleasure, looking, and reading. Literacy of the word is a much more complicated maneuver. That is to say, we're told that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, actually, it's not, because as a matter of fact, which is why you find in newspapers and every time you have a picture, much text has to be put in to stabilize what the picture is. But there is a sense that what you see is what you get in the photo. So there's a kind of scopic, that's a technical word, for visual pleasure that seems much more immediate than the text. And I'm going to kind of undercut that. We tell stories, why? Because that's the way we humanly experience life. And maybe other mammals do. We certainly do. We order the chaos of beginning, middle, end into a structure. But in turn, the structure is one that structures us. Whenever we start into the, well, I met your mother, or I met your father, or when I was little, we are building a narrative that we have compiled to work with the present that we now have. And we read stories because we know the endings, at least implicitly, which is why certain ones of us will read Fox, certain ones of us will read CNN, certain ones will watch the New York Times. We don't follow narratives that are not organized the way we are understanding. And that's largely a matter of habitus where we live. A narrative is a safe ride in another's experience. That, to some extent, we can share. To this day, the humanities tradition has always been about, and people will say, well, you need a degree in English because this teaches you how to be sympathetic with the people, and you take humanities courses, and you learn how to experience what other people experience and makes you a better person. I will question that. There are other things that are happening, but making us a better person because we're looking at other people's narratives. Voyeurism does not make us a better person, I think. And I know this stuff is difficult, and it's hard to think about, and it's hard to, even so far to say these things without my own sense saying, well, that's not me. I mean, that's not how I am. But so here it gets complicated. A narrative, even a memory, isn't a set of facts. When we say, well, when such and such happened, when such and such tragic event happened, this is where I was. Well, clearly, most studies suggest that that's not where we were. That we reconnect to our past by making it up to confirm the present that we have. So a narrative is a fiction, fictive, it's made up. It's a presentation. It may have some facts in it of some kind, whatever that is, but therein lies its often unrecognized politics. If we are compelled by a narrative and don't recognize its politics, that's because we are already sold on it. If we watch 12 Years a Slave, if we watch whatever the film is that we're watching and we don't recognize that it has a politic, you know, Professor Ed, you're ruining my film for me. Well, I'm asking you to read the film. We'll be doing that with what we see today. We're going to be looking at some images. And we are invested in the stories we tell. We're always the heroes of our own narratives, even when we are not always clear what the investments are. And even if we are the victim of our story, that is still a heroic posture. It's what I call the Oprah effect. So what are the emotional goods or investments? What's the commodity exchange, the pleasure of emotional consuming? And I'm sorry to use this kind of money language in buying and selling, but as a matter of fact, that's largely what a lot of this is about, as we'll see. Entertainment is never neutral. The news is never neutral. It represents a unique juncture of personal and social and mythic structures. Enslavement is certainly one that has personal and social and mythic structures. And I'm going to be arguing later that a large part of the rebellion narrative focuses on kind of what I would call the great man theory, which is European, but hides, as a matter of fact, the structural moments and effects against which the great men and women sometimes lost their lives, often, and we can emote about them, can't do anything about it because, as a matter of fact, the structure is what needs to be looked at. And importantly, that ideas control most securely when we don't seem to control the law. And I'm hoping that when we walk away from this afternoon, the first image that we're going to see, we're going to ask ourselves those two most important questions. Who made this? What's their point? And why me? That every image, every presentation, including mine, has a politic. I'm trying to be pretty straightforward with what my politic is, but as a matter of fact, even when I'm saying that, readers are going to say, yeah, but there's other things in the background that he's not saying. You'll know me better than I do after 2 hours. A text or film intends what it does, even when, like ourselves, it doesn't always know what it is intending. A lot of amount of words, and I wish I had more time. But that mainstream narrative and the production of cultural coherence, that is what the economy of resistance narratives produces, as does crime, adventure, horror, romance, and fantasy. I mean, I wrote a book on Stephen King and the Gothic narrative, and Steve says, in the middle of the Gothic horror novel, there's a moral code so severe that the Puritans would smile. Well, the Puritans gave us, sorry to say it, in 1641, they gave us enslavement in Massachusetts. So maybe they know something about this. But the cultural coherence is that, you go to the grocery store and you see the Harlequin romances and the half-bosom unclad female with these kind of hunky men who are, whatever they're doing on the cover, they're not porn, maybe, but so that you can have them in grocery stores, but you look at them and you're going, I don't want my children seeing this. But there are certain positions, male positions and female positions, that we simply accept without ever thinking about them. And you kind of wonder, and even in this era of transgen kind of liberality, and trust me, I don't think we're all liberal on most of these sorts of things. If anyone could be whomever he or she wanted, we're coming back to the binary, him, her. We keep having to put that now even into our names. So the economy of resistance, like any other genre, produces a kind of understanding that is culturally accepted, at least. For example, this is from the Equal Justice Institute, and which is a website that I recommend, and Robert, I will give you that address. The history of the United States is filled with Black Death being made a spectacle for white people, whether it's videos of Black people being killed by police or lynchings becoming community events that entire towns attended. So the question, yeah, okay, what does the narrative serve? Whose spectacle? Whose unspeakable pleasure of the horror text? And I use the word unspeakable from its linguistic roots. If something is so unspeakable, why does one person in the class reading American Psycho have to call up the other person and read him selected portions of this? Okay, if all that we are seeing in CNN is so unspeakable in a good Christian culture, then why are they telling us to send their texts, send us images? Were you there? Someplace in that book on King I wrote, I says that sex is never more public than when it's somebody else's sex, and that's when you can publicize it. But so what sort of pleasures might be involved? New York Times article on lynching, and New York Times is white liberalism at its best and finest. There's no question about it. It identifies 4,000 names of persons who were lynched, but none of the persons' names were white. These persons were not lynched by themselves. They were lynched by, in some cases, mobs of 3,000, and in one case, a mob of 10,000 persons. There are no white names mentioned. Here's the headline of one. Men and boys posed beneath the body of Lee Daniels shortly after he was lynched on August 3rd, 1920. A point about the active and passive voice. When I tell my students not to use passive voice, because the passive voice, it was said by the White House, the passive voice either tells part of the truth, doesn't tell the truth, or simply outright lies. What's happening here in this particular thing, you see that the omission of names, it does show a cultural center of some kind. And I'm going to keep drawing attention to that. Probably most of us, maybe, at least culturally speaking, we're in a situation, maybe it's clear if you think about women. Women go through their life having to change pronouns constantly in text. Humanity and mankind and yada, 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 and we know this and we know this. And you will go, oh, well, no, ladies, but you know that mankind means everybody. And the women go, right. So same thing. And you can say, hey, well, but the Times meant white people. Well, the Times doesn't say that. And that's the question. So a genre is a structure and a box. It's a set of directions on how to read. It asks specific questions. Well, disclosing other questions, abandoning one, like who did the lynching? Because we as spectators are so caught up in the image. The poor set of feet dangling there with not even a person attached to them. And the white eyes staring right into the camera. It's such a riveting image that the other questions are simply ignored. So a way of thinking about images, they're answers to an interview in which we're missing the questions. And so as we walk away today and you go into through this next week, you think about the images that you're going to be seeing. What are the questions the image poses? What does it try to answer? How does it manage the crisis it announces? Now here, the crisis, of course, is very different because the New York Times' crisis is a white liberal crisis, and it's like tutting about lynching, and again, lynching that happened almost 100 years ago, and it's doing the work of enslavement in the past, which keeps things safely distant from the New York Times having to do the work right now of looking at its own self and saying, how is it that we are caught up in the spectational mode of this? And again, honestly, blaming the lynched victim for being lynched because the persons doing the lynching are not mentioned at all. And who or what, finally, is the moral center? So you look at these narratives, white slave African masters, slave narratives, members of captivity, slavery and survival as a Far East POW, escape from slavery, One of the things you see immediately that there is a genre out there. There's a kind of a fill in the blanks. That whatever kind and type of enslavement and captivity, there is already out there a way and a grammar of understanding it. 1676, one of the most famous, and anyone here in my hearing who has been in American studies or has done any kind of work in early colonial literature, a narrative of the captivity, sufferings, and removes of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. A very famous, and you can see the image. The image is trying to do work that depicts things. You have the indigenous persons here, and you have the colonial woman there. Interestingly enough, this book had to be introduced by a male and by Cotton Mather and closed by a male because, of course, a woman could not tell her own story. And as a matter of fact, she had been taken captive and was returned, and she's always kind of suspect goods after that. But from 1676, there was a genre in place on how to read enslavement and captivity. We don't have time to answer all these questions, but just to pose the thing. So how do these images and text produce an ideal reader? A coherent subject. So that as soon as we see Escape from Slavery, or 12 Years a Slave, or Rebellion, or Resistance, or the narrative of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, we may never have read all of these things, but we already know what the movement is. Because clearly, if it's an escape from slavery, and I don't usually use the word slavery, I would use enslavement. If there's an escape from it, well, it's going to have a happy ending. And trust me, we don't read narratives that don't have happy endings of some kind. But it hides from the obliging reader the often retrograde means by which coherency is produced. I spoke a moment ago about going to the grocery store, giant, just a simple giant, and going to the book rack, and you're seeing babes and lads and outfits or not outfits that you want to have you take your children and your dogs and put them behind you and say, I don't want my people seeing this. But we are in back to Stephen King and horror. In the early eras of Gothic advertisement, you would find men and women. You'd find women in these poses, and the monster would be carrying them away. And they test marketed them with 12-year-olds, 12-year-old males, because it was the libidinal aspect of the text that was catching people. So we have to firewall away our own sadism. We like seeing people beat up. I'm so sorry to say that, unless they're puppies. We don't like puppies being hurt, okay? So toward my first point, I'm going to move on here a little bit, very specifics. In most historical treatments of issues regarding Africans, and I don't use the word African because African is a colonial word. It was the colonial word, that there were 3,000 different ethnicities and groups in the continental Africa, but Africa pre-colonial times was the top northern boundary of it. The role of blacks is diminished or obscured by European scholars, better by European genres. Most often, African descent persons are relegated to a peripheral status. The pleasure of the tale is about them only insofar as the captivity narrative needs them. Well, we needed Mary Douglass to be taken away and ravaged by the Indians so that we could, one, blame the Indians, and then actually, as happens in the text, blame Mrs. Rowlandson because, well, she must have permitted them to do this. So the structure of the European genres, Gothic and sentimental, both work this way, we'll see, like a reality TV. Horror and sentimentality go back and forth. The topic, rebellion and resistance. The enslaved population is recast in a narrative of heroism and individuality that is surely Western, and we'll see this. Colonial, European. Shorthand, white. And I have things to say, legal things to say on the words resistance and rebellion, because as a matter of fact, these kinds of words suggest a legal point of resistance to a legal culture, and Black Americans, in many respects, were de-stateless persons. They were colonized persons without access to law, and I'm going to start with the Supreme Court and the Constitution and Declaration. The most foundational white privilege, number 4, is that of owning the story and its terms. You hear this, for example, in terms of interiorized whiteness, interiorized homophobia, interiorized gynecology. When those who can tell the story can make me feel the way they want me to feel. well, I'm a homosexual, so therefore I must be kind of weak and effeminate and yada 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 yada. Well, because that's what my culture's narrative about masculinity tells me. So when I start taking that stuff into my particular head, that shows that that narrative, that colonial tool works. So narrative is power, and Marx puts it best. He says, and this is not a good quote necessarily, he says, the best weapon that a culture has is not its bombs, it's not its economy, but the way that it has to make somebody in the culture who has nothing else to benefit, nonetheless accept the narrative. He's talking about here about the worker. So the greatest weapon of the colonizer, convincing the colonized of the rightness of their text. This is a headline, Slavery Stories in the Age of Black Lives Matter. You may have seen films, you see a Western, you finally get tired of them, and then finally you see what they call spaghetti Westerns. So that even genres get tired, and they need to be re-upped. So here what you're seeing, even with the best intentions, slavery stories, again, the point is, this is not history, it's a story. In the age of Black Lives Matter. So how do we now take this narrative and still keep it functioning for us? How do we talk about it? Since now we're in quote, hashtag Black Lives Matter. So narrative is pleasure, a pleasure of denouncing, a pleasure of consumption, the often righteous thrill of condemning, or the thrill unacknowledged of imagining it. Even the title that Robert, bless your heart, Robert, chose to use for today. It hits all the right, sorry, it hits all the right buttons, and folks who want to hear, again, another thing on Black agency and how we put all this in the past and how we're much better than that. This is probably not that presentation. And I thought long and hard about how to think about this. And which is why I use the word rise. The rise is out of the discourse of the enslaved themselves. So the unspoken contract with the reader, and this is the first of a couple times I'll talk about this, and every text makes this contract with us to shock, to titillate, to excite, to horrify me or us in all the ways that I find pleasurable, but hide from me my involvement. Hide from me that, you know what, I get a certain kind of something out of watching other people get, I don't know, tied up, get freed. I get a certain, what is it? I don't really know because I don't think about it and I don't like to think about it, but just give me another Harlequin romance. Okay? If you want to know what prison people live in, show me their fantasies. This is kind of that. So the power of the narrative lies in the telling, and I'm just putting in here slavery, the entertainment, white show. These are terms that you will see. I want to come back here to Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a classic 1852 volume by the wife of a minister. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her subtitle was originally "The Man Who Became a Thing," and Uncle Tom. And I want to point out here that Uncle Tom itself comes into the discourse as a piece of genre. It's like Jim Crow or Aunt Jemima, Uncle Tom. These are character types, okay? And probably we don't know anything about them because we probably have not read the book. We don't know who Uncle Tom is. Uncle Tom was largely the strongest presence in the book, and she points out, and she's trying to make a certain kind of Christ figure, that's her language, out of Uncle Tom. So it's interesting to see how certain kinds of images nonetheless circulate still with us. Narrative trajectories script the silences a telling cannot accommodate. Long words by that is to say that every image that you see, including this one, and you see a little cabin, and I want you to notice this, that women in these genres are always inside. Okay? Now go back to Mary Rowlandson. You saw her at the doorway of her house. What are the things about witch narratives? Witches take the brooms that they should be using to clean the house and they fly out and they go wherever the hell they want, pardon my French. So when you stop and you think about this way, that why these Halloween images look the way they do, why do they have brooms? Because they're women, they're gendered to do this kind of work, and they're gendered to do it, sorry, in an enclosed space. So to return, why do we, who's the we, who recirculate these narratives? Narratives, pleasures, many, obscure. TV, The Walking Dead, serial killers, wars, or pain, and oh sex. Usually these are peoples not like us. Violence becomes a kind of a floating category that we can attach to other people who live in other places, who do other kinds of things, or may live here with us, but they're strangers, they're aliens, you know the language. They're Trumpites, they're homosexuals, they're this or that, they're the other thing. They're not like us. CNN, classic. Are you at this terrible place, wherever the chief lawyer Anderson is? Send pictures. They still do that. It astonishes me. That they elicit from their viewers a voyeurism. You want to say, what's that all about anyway? Pleasures and perversities of the worst kind is okay so long as they're not our perversities. So we read happily on and what is that about? A narrative is a representation, a representation. That's its unacknowledged politic. To be compelled by the narrative is to accept its politic, even if unconsciously. You can say, oh, well, no, I don't really believe that. All right, here's where we start getting into some of the meat now. I apologize for taking the time. With all this as a background, I'm going to come to what I would call the uprising narrative. And, you know, it's a very masculine sounding, and it's uprising, and it's rebellion, and it's revolt, and it's all hooey, as we know. But still, it makes good reading. I mentioned earlier about the kind of the westernized format, the genre, the reader expectation. Okay, Henry Aptheker writes what is considered a classic text in 1937, and this is his title, American Negro Slave Revolts. That's his title. I wouldn't put it that way, for all kinds of reasons. The title alone demonstrates the narrative politic. He writes, the persistent and desperate struggles of the African or the American Negro against slavery took 8 forms, none of which have yet received anything like the treatment they deserve. His view here is safely scholarly. He's a Marxist. He's going to be looking at power. I agree with his point of view. You're going to see over here in the map slave insurrections. And I'm going to move that out of the way a little bit. From a certain given particular period of time, 1526 to 1864. And by the way, the 1526, I do want to point out that while I love the New York Times, generally speaking, and the work it does in this area, this 1619 project has an omission, I'm sorry to say it, that the enslavement, including indigenous Americans, started 125 years before 1619. And this particular map indicates that. But the language of insurrection and these other kinds of uprisings and rebellions, they presume a legal government in place. No one Black American, because most of them were born here, the indigenous Africans and later Black Americans were stateless persons. We colonized them. There was no access to law. And that sounds like I'm throwing down the gauntlet. It's true, and we'll start with the Supreme Court. Rebellion, uprising, insurrection, resistance, all these terms in the first place are commonplace Gothic terms. Western Gothic, sentimental, see Les Mis, carried over into the Western Gothic of the US, John Wayne. The terms in these meanings privilege a politics and a gendered structure, because the women persons in all of this tend to be, they're placekeepers. For better or for worse, a presumed acknowledgement of a pre-told continuity of, oh, well, we know this narrative. There were slaves, and then there were certain great people like John Brown, who basically wasn't Black himself, but whatever. There was Nate Turner, and then there was this guy over here, Gabriel Prosser, and they uprose, and they failed, of course, because, well, they did, but we can now tell their story. Well, you know, that's a narrative for, I'll say it, a white reader. Or maybe not white, but culturally white, because this is how we work, and this is how, like, being, a 6-year-old homosexual Catholic boy can grow up and become, whatever you are, because as a matter of fact, we all start off straight, according to the culture. How women reading texts I'll start off as unacknowledged men, because that's what the text is. Okay, so when a woman says to me, well, I'm not really like the girls, I'm like one of the guys. No, we don't want to do that. So even following the legal end of enslavement, the narratives keep enslavement extra legal, but visible. Resistance, privileges, and authority with warrant. There's a government. The narrative of resistance derives from a European humanist tradition of the male hero achieving against the dominus. This is, again, I want you to look at the image and I want you to just look at all the parts of it. And you're going to ask yourself, well, here's the narrative. Here's an interview, okay? There's a certain libidinal interest in it. There's a certain, it's well poised, and there's a certain kind of, I'm sorry to say it quite this way, there's certainly a sadistic pleasure, and someone's getting beaten, as Floyd would say to us, and what do we do with that? But so any structure of meaning puts in place an unacknowledged grammar, genre, and gender and language. And this is all outside, as you can see. It's nowhere near, there's no homes, no nation. So it exists all by itself. But clearly, by looking at the reference, the image, it doesn't. So I want to entwine this narrative of white agency. I mean, I'm a white guy myself, I understand that. And so how do I talk about any of this myself, which has been one of my particular questions, without doing and activating the same kind of libidinal pleasures? Well, I don't. I'm a white guy in a white culture, and I have no access to an experience that nonetheless needs to be unpacked. So I'm trying to unpack the pleasures of the white power emotion dynamic. I want to question that narrative, and this is what Bell Hooks says, speaking in the voice of the colonialist. There is no need to hear your native voice when I can speak and I can talk about you better than you can speak about yourself. No need to hear your voice. Only tell me about your pain. I want to know your story. And then I will tell it back to you in a new way. I will tell it back to you in such a way that it has become mine, my own. Rewriting you, I write myself anew. I'm still author, authority. I'm still the colonizer, the speaking subject. And you are now the center of my talk. This is what I call the Oprah effect. We're always the heroes of our own stories. Frederick Douglass is an example. He's a guy we like. He's an ex-slave. He freed himself. Actually, he didn't, but he escaped and was basically paid $706 in 1848 for his freedom. He wrote a number of texts. He wrote a number of autobiographies. It's interesting to see, they have to tell you this, written by himself. Okay? Because the later editions, he actually talks about my life. So this first one is somebody else's narrative or somebody else's permission putting him together. So the complications of who is speaking and how they're speaking and what happens to even a Black American who in 1845 is stateless. He has to be freed by supporters from Britain. He has no state. He's an escaped property, and even then by Supreme Court rule, as you will see. Okay, the master narratives, and I use the word master there since we can no longer use master bedroom in the houses. I understand that, I use that word, but I wanted to think about the dynamics here of that particular word. Words of power, we're going to do three things in this section. Declaration, Constitution, Supreme Court, 1619 and 1526, we already talked about that. 1619, whatever we're going to do, truncates American history of enslavement by 115 years, 125 years. And come Columbus Day, you can see what I'm talking about on that. And you can see in Columbus's own contract with Queen Isabella, where he got 10% for every indigenous Indian he brought back to Spain as an enslaved person. He did. These are texts. Narratives of power, gender and representation. You saw one back here a moment ago. We saw this guy over here. This is something you would see on a Harlequin romance novel. Do people buy it? They clearly do. flies out of the shelves in the way that the New York Times does not, I'll tell you. Third point, memory is not history, it's fiction. Fiction is not a bad word. It simply means that there is a producer of this. It's factoid, it's made up. There's a making of it. And so why do we remember? Very quickly, if you've heard me before on this, it's a stateless people by law, Constitution and the Supreme Court. What the Declaration doesn't say. This is the 1619 Project, and I said I like it a lot, lots of things. The Constitution contains 84 clauses. 6 deal directly with the enslaved, and in enslavement, 5 more hold implications for slavery. Okay. The Constitution, in red, protects the property of those who enslaved black people, prohibits the federal government from interfering to end the importation of enslaved indigenous for 20 years, allows Congress to mobilize the militia to put down insurrections by the enslaved, force states that outlawed slavery to turn over enslaved people who had run away seeking refuge. Brian, last paragraph, says this trenchantly. The words are dark and ambiguous, such as no plain man of common sense would have used, and are evidently chosen to conceal from Europe that in this enlightened country, the practice of slavery has its advocates among men of the highest nations. John Adams, former president, actually used this text to free the captive enslaved persons who were taken off a ship, the Amistad. The Dred Scott decision, 1857, renders the Declaration unimportant to the issue of race, and we can come back to, I want to come back to that particular picture if I can find it. July 4th, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to divide the political bonds that have joined them to another. That is where the line, we hold these rights to be self-evident. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of, he borrows from Locke, happiness. Locke has property. It has nothing to do with human rights. It says nothing at all about the female with whom he is sleeping, who's 14 years old, who, or the son, the other enslaved person, the enslaved half-sister. It has nothing to do with the lack of rights that his married wife, Martha, would have, or does not have. Okay, it's our ability as a political country to choose. Dred Scott, Taney writes, in the opinion of the histories of the times and language used in the Declaration of Independence show that, quote, in red, the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, notice, he understands that they are persons who have been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. This is a Supreme Court document. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Okay. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic. For those who don't know the text, that comes as an astonishing thing. From 1857 through 1857 through 1870, particularly, there was no law, no legal status at all that a black American could access of. And even as an enslaved person, there was no law. These persons have no state. They cannot rebel. They cannot resist. They're colonized persons. There is something that you might want to call organized violence, but as a matter of fact, that's something that's very different. So that brings us to the question of, okay, so what do we do with this great big giant elephant in the middle of the table? We have these people here, we don't know what they are, they're not ours, but we have to talk about them as if they're family, and we kind of sentimentalize it, again, using that kind of very European genre. Because clearly they can't do what they need to do for themselves, and so it's family, we take care of them, but they're our domestics. How does the structure of enslavement represented in an era of white anxiety? Probably much of this is familiar. They direct this against the men and women and lots of children who lived in a caste system with them, and you still have the reference of, you will still catch the thing about Catholics and blacks and the number of children that they have. It is never a compliment when you're told that you have lots of children. Okay, it might sound like it's a compliment, but there's a point being made here that they decide to on a particular packet. So we're living in a caste system, and this is a caste system. It's segregation. Yes, it's white segregation. Okay, Wilkerson does a thing on this, and it's worth paying attention to, but don't be distracted by the language of black segregation, because truly the effect is meant to segregate white people away from. So the expressions of Aunt Jemima and Jim Crow and the myth of the happy darky, three of these in particular are part of the sentimental narratives of the time that work to displace the narrative and the Gothic horror. And again, you can go back and you can see any horror film that you've ever seen. There's always going to be the Once Upon a Time. There's going to be the happy family, you know, and the parents go out and the kids are left at home and they just say, don't answer the phone, don't ring the doorbell. So the Gothic horror monster always comes into the nice, safe, sweet family. It comes from someplace else, usually some other particular country. We don't know where it comes from, and it destroys what we hold valuable. This is the genre. We know this. Okay, read CNN, read Fox, listen to even the New York Times will do this. Why are they always singing and dancing? Well, we know that. What you don't see in the background is the whole lot of them. And compare this to the image you saw before of the gentleman, I freed myself. The tools of colonialism, the camera is always white. It always astonishes me. Even when you go touring, you stop someplace and you can't speak their language, they can't speak your language, you'll say, can we take a picture? They just shake their head and say, and they stand and stare. And they pose, because we all know how to pose for portraits. We always know how to pose for photography. Why do we pose standing like this? Because in the image of the original photographs took time to set up, took time to take. And that image on taking, there's a kind of possessiveness about the narrative. Language and the camera starts with the narrative voice, and the public's a voice and the camera that takes the image. Photography is a social practice, and it basically was developed around the tools of the 17th and 18th and 19th early century in terms of colonialism and documenting for the empires at home who the products were. It's a social practice whose connotations were organized through the cultural ideas and contracts. Years ago, there's a picture during Clinton's trial. There's a picture on the front page of the International Herald. I was in Norway at the time doing teaching, and you saw the picture of Clinton, and he had his head down like this, and so it read like, well, you know, he's being found guilty, or he's doing this, and then you turn the page and you see that the text says, you know, Clinton at so and so's funeral. So be paying attention is that why is this cropped exactly the way it is? You know, it's perfectly formed all the way. You see down, center, male, okay? Even the men are at the center. So paying attention to how the frame works. The standard issue enslavement photograph produced for the, can I say it, white gaze? What questions does this or should these pose for us? I will tell you that I don't look at the one on the left, and is that my own, whatever. I keep saying, Ed, how can I keep recirculating these? And that's a question that I have. I would rather eliminate this kind of material than Confederate statues, for example. But there is a kind of scopic pleasure. We don't necessarily know what it is. You can call it rubbernecking. We can just say, ooh, how terrible that is, and I don't want it for me, but it's okay for them. At some and lots of kinds of levels, trying to analyze our own particular images and why we're doing what we do, why we view what we do. Okay. All right, with this. 1856. Where is the viewer investment here? Why this combination of topics? Why do we reactivate all of this in 1956? Do you think? And as always, the camera and the words direct away from the subject. Life magazine is, how to say it politely, is in the habit of producing a kind of a sentimentalized, back to the artist, the way that they use it, of the white viewer it's like Newsweek. It's very much the central middle class. And here you have segregation the colorful GOP convention, and then you have this narrative here, the slave auction in Old Charleston in 1956. Then you come over here to the other side. A photograph is not a matter of fact. It's a fact of presenting the material. That is its politic. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are a black person, what do you do with someone standing over there taking your picture like this? What is the responsibility of the filmer? You go from the banal, ice milk sold here, to the legal. And this is not simply social practice. This is legal law. And I have a catalog of 6,000 separate local and separate laws. And the reason civil rights had never went anywhere on the federal end of it, because the federal law was one thing, but it was a state and the federal laws, it's like masking. And individual states and individual communities can do very different kinds of things. Okay, back to gender. And you have, again, the image of they must like what they're doing. They're always happy. Here are the pictures of them, okay? You see Uncle Tom's Cabin again, and you see that same banjo, and you probably see here already an image of a woman who would then become, even down to the outfits that she's wearing, down here to her, Aunt Jemima. And there's a history behind all this, and Quakers Oats took all of this over. But we understand this at a certain point. But when we start paying attention to, there are no workers anywhere. It's all happy and it's all peaceful. But think about this very specifically at the directions that the narratives are sending us. Okay? That not only is there gender, but there are narrative directions here in terms of the domestic. This is a kind of an odd one because it's out in the middle of nowhere, but they're usually very pointed about where they present these. Women, children, men. John Brown, a white guy, so of course he looks like God. There was a question that Robert asked me earlier about how Nat Turner's rebellion here and John Brown's rebellion, quote, ended up having such a different press, and this guy gets a state park, and well, because he's a northerner, he's an abolitionist, and he's striking a blow for freedom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So of course he would be the one that they would give the park to, and however they clucked about what he was trying to do. As a matter of fact, he was heroic because he was on quite the right side of history. Nat Turner, for example, activated all of Virginia fears. Okay, and I see people raising their hand, and I hope that Robert is going to help because I can't read any of that at the moment. The implicit narrative gendering, most obviously the male great man, full frontal mode. Now, this is the later edition of Douglass. My bondage and my freedom. This is not a third party, but they have to say written by himself. It's a small detail, but pay attention to the details. Gabriel Prosser, for example, these are full frontal images of persons that you don't get with the women, okay? But the Gothic horror of this and the sentimental uplift of this, they're the two things, two poles. Okay. Then you have the odd Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, and you're going, well, these were women who had a kind of agency that they escaped from the genre. Here's Sojourner Truth talking to Lincoln about what he's going to do about the persons who we know this about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not a legal text. It governed no enslaved person in the area that Lincoln was then technically president of. It freed the enslaved of the nations, or the city-states, of the states in secession, much as did the Tories in 1776. They offered, Lord Dunham offered freedom to any black American who would come to their side. And many did, 10,000 did. Another standard image, and I will tell you, that this here, that images of the fear and the fright of Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser come back here to 1791 and the Haitian massacre. And you just look at the language, the massacre of French Haitians during the uprising of the black slaves. The point being, it was something like 9-1 enslaved to 10% of white Europeans. And so the language itself obfuscates the thing. The Louisiana Purchase, the reason we got it as cheaply as we did, and the reason that Jefferson bought it without any kind of access, any kind of commerce with the government, any kind of permission to do it, because Jefferson was president, but he was first a trader and a marketer in male slaves. And you can read his own text. They needed a place to go west to expand the country, to sell the enslaved product. And so the fear of what was happening in Haiti, which is basically right across the border, which we only got, in terms of the colonials only got, as the states came in through the various, they didn't have internet, for example. Nat Turner, again, so shocked Virginia. I mean, after all, these are our people, we take care of them, they're our families. Why are they doing all this to us? So the underlying fear of having a decolonized people in our midst, and remember, in 1790, there were something like 70,000, I forget the exact figure, 70,000 black slaves, indigenous Africans. By the census of 1860, there were 4 million. Now, this is in a country in which enslavement by constitution was designed to go away. So you get the point. But as you see here, they're telling you how to read the narrative. There's actually points, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see the domestic icons of the women and children. We still do this. If you see a headline article, women and children in X, or that, you know, student lunches in X, you know, for example, there's a sentimental point that's going to be made. But the problem with this kind of what I call operatic arias in public, these kinds of scenes don't ever change anything. The women and children are still not being fed properly, they're still not being taken care of properly, but nonetheless, we can still use them. Yeah. Frederick Douglass, the younger Frederick Douglass, this is from his text on Life in Bondage. I'm not going to read it to you right now, but you can hear his own particular language. And earlier on, he still has a kind of sense of, he still writes better than anybody that I know, and he's to the point. The reason that he's so armored for us in this genre, because he could be a male heroine in any particular thing. He speaks of it as a battle. He says it's a turning point in his career as a slave. It may have left him as a bond slave, but not with the sense of a slave himself. He says, it revived within me my sense of my own manhood. So that much of the narrative that we're doing here is a way of renegotiating the terms of manhood and femalehood, for example. And then there's the class narrative. And so narcissistic are we that we can only capable of that these persons, when they had a chance, the only thing that they could do for entertainment was to dress up like us and have what we call a cakewalk. Okay? And the point here is that we don't really pay attention to the cakewalk. You got a cake. The person who imitated the master, the better. Right, but you also want to understand that in this particular case, where does the agency of the enslaved person come from? The enslaved person has a bit of freedom to talk about things, put someone a costume on, and well, they're just kind of imitating, and ha ha ha, it's all a joke. So there is a different sense to that. Okay, here's where for me it gets a little more complicated in the sense that when you move beyond 1865 and enslavement, you have not moved beyond its narrative weight. The Equal Justice Initiative says that this, again, the formal abolition of slavery did nothing to overcome the harmful ideas created to defend it, and so slavery did not end, it evolved. And this is the question that Ta-Nehisi Coates poses in The Atlantic 2014. 250 years of slavery, and then Jim Crow, and then redlining. Very quickly, two poles between which a viewer or reader oscillates: voyeurism and witness. And so while certain renderings of slave subjection lend themselves to simply consumption, there's no other word for it, they also contain an imperative way to do witness. And so in my objectives here for the remainder is to look now more specifically, not at the genre itself, and I'm sure if you want to talk about specific texts and rebellions and revolts, and just to be clear that that kind of language assumes in place a legal framework that simply doesn't obtain, simply does not obtain. So you're looking here at an overview of from 1865 through 2021, 100 years of Jim Crow, beyond the end of race enslavement. It's 156 years, actually. I'm going to draw the attention to the shadow of enslavement in the social dynamics. And by that, I'm going to go back to Hegel, the master-slave power dynamic, in the absence of any attention to this in effective language. And by the way, that kind of social power dynamic, and you can go back to Hannah Arendt in this particular thing, men and women do this constantly. Much of our TV, what they call, the bedroom comedies and the Doris Day. So you have the female male power dynamics and who has it, and how do they keep it. We're looking at that similarly, and the one we're looking at here simply keeps in play the narrative and the images of a legal period of time, but that still has consequences. I'm going to pay attention to the genres of meaning that these representation, how we traverse spectacle, voyeurist consumption, ethically motivated witness. And throughout this, I'm going to say more clearly that while so much of the narrative is premised on the individual great person narrative, personal freedom, agency, even with my bondage and my freedom with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was powerless to do anything else than be free himself. Even on July 4th, his wonderful July 4th pronouncement. So if you're an enslaved person, if you have enslaved persons in your family, and you walk into a classroom and your teacher says "Happy 4th of July," what are you going to say? That's basically his point. So however free that Douglass could be, he was still legally not free because they had to pay him money. Again, a point I made before, which is why we don't want to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill to replace Andrew Jackson, the Indian killer. None of this seems very coherent. It's coherent culturally speaking, and that's, I hope, what we're trying to dismantle here. But Douglass, Tubman, Sojourner Truth, they could not change the structural and systemic statelessness of these particular persons. The first Emancipation Proclamation in DC, which is the emancipation with compensation, this was, you may not even know this, 1862, 8 months before Lincoln's document. That particular document gave compensation to the slave owners. But Tubman, not Tubman, Sojourner Truth, the only thing she could do was go to Lincoln and say, can we have more mules for the people that are escaping from the South? Who, by the way, ended up in Washington in what they call camps, just camps of collateral camps. This is where it all gets difficult. This is after 1870. This is slavery has been abolished. The Civil War amendments, 12, 13, 14, have been 13, 14, 15 have been passed. Technically, there is legal access to freedom and to rights, and the Supreme Court in 1870 through 1875 vitiates all of these and says about the 13th document, the 13th Amendment, well, the federal can legislate for federal identity, but not for states. And again, you want to go back and read this is the way the Supreme Court itself, in 10 years, dismantled all of this. We never hear about that in school. 1866, public sale. They're still selling, quote, Negroes, okay? Ta-Nehisi Coates, 250 years of slavery. We're talking about that. 90 years of Jim Crow, maybe more. Separate but equal. 35 years of racist housing policy. And we hear about Evanston, and we hear about California, we hear about Asheville and we hear about different things. Okay, when you start putting all of this together, convict leasing. Oh, well, you're on the sidewalk and you're loitering, so we're going to you're a vagrant, so we're going to put you into prison for vagrancy laws. You say, oh, but that was 1865. In 1956, the first time that Dr. Martin Luther King was put in prison was as a vagrant under the very same law. So then what happens when they get into prison? Then they are rented out to pay for their services. This picture here is cut off on the side. I don't want to really show you the whole thing. Again, the image of the respect we have for narrative and the camera. We'll just stand here and pose. Oh, can I take your picture? So the question of these slides is not the horrifying images, but the complicated pleasures of the various viewers. I'm going to show you 3 different particular slides here. By the way, this is not 1870, this is not 1850, this is not 1840, and it's not the South, it's Delaware. Okay, it's 1920. So this, you can kind of see the text. Clearly a very well-built man, so you have a kind of a libidinal interest here. You have some kind of beating or whipping going on. 50 Shades of Grey. Hey, whatever you like, right? Right. So paying attention to the way the narrative is framed here and asking ourselves is, we can accept this, but and also the circularity of the people viewing. There's always that loop between who's viewing, how they're viewing. So my points again on this. This is not the South and it's not the 1700s. Okay, that guy is the mayor, the sheriff. Would you have your children watch this? This is 1920, Dover, Delaware. The tale is the teller's, the European genre expectations, and the narrative is always in the white eye of the beholder. One very good, Elizabeth, I forget her last name, I'm sorry, she said about the beatings of Rodney King, black people, would you look at this? Meaning, why would you look at this? Kind of my point. But so, quote, post-enslavement, but the existing arc ending at the Civil War disguises and displaces the continuing statelessness and weaponization of race. Now, the first time I've talked about this. So now, after 1870, you don't get the language of enslavement. You get the word of race upset, okay? Racial unrest. So you have a kind of a double image, and race is a misdirection, I'm going to say, a stand-in for a social power dynamic. And here we're reading the frame as well, okay? This is a photograph that's kind of like a postcard. It's in a postcard book. And we probably know Sanctuary, the book of enslaved or lynching photographs that were used as postcards. I'm not suggesting you should look it up. Just having the information in your head is, you're going to ask yourself, what do you do with this stuff once you get it in your head? 1889. A different sheriff, a different post, a different audience. It's a genre. Again, this time is posed. There are people on all sides. These are squared off photographs. They're not on the cuff, okay? Somebody has taken time to develop this particular photograph. Okay. In fact, over 1,600 persons were publicly and legally whipped in Delaware from 1900 to 1945. 1,500 of them were black. The last public flogging took place in 1952. The punishment was finally outlawed in 1972. The numbers game, how language and discourse keeps history safely colonized as a politic, a genre, and a fantasy of a white past. Aptheker, whom we talked about earlier, says there were 250 revolts before the Civil War. Wikipedia, which is not necessarily the best source, but there are others, the Brennan Report on Police Violence, lists 350 civil unrest after 1865. Oh, that's very interesting. Apathy says when more than 10 people were involved or property was lost. Wikipedia has more or less the same, only they say 20 or 30 persons with more unrest. And this is how we end up now having it. We get up on the 4 or 5 quote rebellions that we know. And one of the points we're going to see here in a moment that most of the rebellions that we know were really when we were still British colonialists. So there's some ways they were safe for us to talk about because, well, they really weren't ours. They were the Brits. The rebels, and again, they are stateless. If they said stateless, there's nothing that they are rebelling against. This is not a governmental move. They were joined by 40 to 50 more during the 15-mile march. They killed at least 20, but spared others. That's an interesting detail. I wonder why they did that. You move along to the front. The militia caught the rebels, killing at least 34 of them. This odd sense of how many people got killed in all of this. What we don't ever talk about here is the South Carolina Code of 1740, which every other state copied. So the telling of history is writing the history. And these are the narratives that I'm sure some of us have some kind of familiarity or sense with, and I don't want to simply retail them here, and you can follow, I can give you information and you can look them up yourself. I want to draw the attention to the narrative, the revolt, rebellion, insurrection, uprising, rebellion, okay? I talked a moment ago about Nat Turner's rebellion. We talked a little bit later about Brown's rebellion. Notice that all of these are all safe to talk about because they're so far history, they're not even our own particular country, okay? Do we know these? No. We know these. We don't know these. Good. Why? Why do we pick out 6 or 7? You know, I talked about this when this was one of the early ones that helped Virginia understand that its veneer of these are our people and we're taking care of them in the plantations. This really wasn't going to fly. This very early one again still has the whiff of what's happening in Jamaica. This is simply 1805 is probably the first year that the Louisiana Purchase was really part of our particular venue. So you begin to see that this is probably the largest one in terms of numbers and the most Western. Again, why do we not know these? Back to the slide earlier on. Narrative politics guides our rememory. The already known, the one that confirms our doxa. Doxa is what every one of us has a sense of common sense. Well, you know, I don't read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post because, well, it suits me, or I read the International Herald. We don't ever think about why we choose Fox or why we choose CNN or why we choose NBC or why, we don't think about these things, although the narratives that we are getting from these places fall beginning, middle, and end into a certain format that we appreciate. Slave rebellions, American uprising, Amistad, Benicia, remembering slavery. Do you see any women on any of these? Just for starts. Just kind of make my point. You certainly see the conventions, and by now I hope we understand that. The Encyclopedia of Slave Resistance and Rebellion, and even going back to the Spartacus. Women seem to have nothing to do with any of this thing. So how numbers and narrative expectations distract? What happens to this exculpatory narrative? These are all black people. There are no white people, okay? The people against whom they are rebelling, quote, to use that word, are nowhere in evidence. Do you see books that say the structures of enslavement and legal segregation in Alabama, in Montgomery? Not here, you don't. Do you see those kinds of books anywhere? Not so much. People are not going to buy them. So my point here is that you have the focus on an individual. and it becomes a kind of a public aria, something, it's an operatic thing that we can do in public in which nothing changes. We can keep having these books about remembering slavery and American uprising and Gabriel's rebellion, but nothing is going to change. One historian between the 2 centuries preceding the American Civil War, and we'll talk about this in a moment, we keep talking about the 2 centuries preceding the American Civil War as if that's the end of it. One historian found documented evidence for more than 250 uprisings, or attempted uprisings involving 10 or more slaves whose aim was personal freedom. But that's what I'm trying to change here, or at least query. This is a typical headline. This is the National Geographic. How 2 centuries of slave revolts shaped American history. Again, it's very self-congratulatory, not necessarily for the enslaved persons. It challenges the institution of slavery itself. Shattered contemporary stereotypes of enslaved peoples. Well, let's talk about those stereotypes. Who are they serving? They're European strategies, I think. They're for white people. They're not the Black Americans. See, in the language, let's go back to the New York Times and that first example of what the New York Times is writing about. It's writing to a culturally white point of view. So let's look at the numbers. 250 incidences from 1636, notice my dates are not 1619, and 1865 to the end of the Civil War. 1636 was when the first slave, John Punch, ran away, escaped his master with 2 Europeans. The 2 Europeans were returned. Here they were indentured servants, and so was Punch. The 2 Europeans received 3 extra years on their term. John Punch, the indigenous African, received life, vita durante, first time in law in the colonies. But so reframing the narrative of resistance and freedom, incidences since 1860 to 221, 335, 250, 335. The 335, any incident of combat, they call it by race, between races, in which persons were killed, lost, property damaged. The red are in the north, not the south. 13 in the south in 1940, 8 in the north. 5 in the south, 2. 63 in the 40s in the south, in 1960, 49 in England, New England. 30 in 1970, 32 in the south, 17. 1988 in the south, 4. 2010, 2019, 31. 23, the numbers are going back up. 1919, 68 in the south, 40 in the north. So the numbers show the existing narratives must change, and I'm sorry to put all the material together like this, but you can begin to see that to talk about resistance or uprisings or revolts as something in the past is to completely misread the political and social and human dynamic of a stateless people before the 15th century until now. So given these numbers, what's in this work of remembering? And it is a work. It's an opera. It's an opus operatus. It's a work. What's in it for the culture, for individuals? Why do we go to Giant and we see the Harlequin romances? What do we get with having these, what we call the Harlequin romance, or the flick chick, or the or the guy film? Why do we sort things this way? Or why does culture sort things, and why do we allow ourselves to be sorted? Why some narratives rather than others? Well, remembering his work, and we like some of these narratives because there's something about Nat Turner. He was big and manly, and there's a new Nat Turner film out recently with and then suddenly there was some background narrative around that, and so suddenly this particular very challenging and probably award-winning film suddenly drops off the map because there are other issues here, and I have to say it, the black director, um, is somehow being discredited. Well, one wonders. So Gothic or sentiment, the use of power to threaten or to ennoble. So these narratives feed an unacknowledged need for different kinds of emotions. You show me someone's prison and I'll show you their fantasy. You show me their fantasy, I'll show you someone's fantasy. And I'm not saying that all of us need emotional violence. Okay. Make it very clear about that, but that as we find ourselves gravitating to certain sections of the library or certain sections of online books with Apple, I choose science fiction. I like world building. And they do ask us, well, so why do I pick this? Why do I skip the slides I don't want to show? And even the slides that I do put up here, why don't want to put them all out there? It's a complicated relay. So the contract with the reader, it's firewalled for us. Titillate me, frighten me, excite me, exculpate me, but don't tell me how that happens. Don't let me see what I have to appreciate or like. Don't let me see my own particular, I'll call it sadism, and it's not the word that we think it is. It's a way of looking at a power dynamic. The Arc of Justice, Dr. Martin Luther King's expression that he borrowed from Theodore Parker, white Congregationalist minister. If we had a semester course, we could do this. Regeneration Through Violence, a classic American studies book. And we're looking at violence as an American kind of founding scene, as that even the Declaration of Independence, when in the revision of it, when Jefferson talks about, the savages on the frontier, he has sent people to, the King George. Well, really, the savages on the frontier were people in legal places that we had given them. We call them now resorts. These were nations, and their nations were being overwritten by European, Anglo-Saxon persons from Britain and Northern Europe who were coming through and wanting to go into the lands. For example, the Homestead Act. This was not something that the Native Americans were doing. Okay, so weaponizing race and the lost cause. So the plot's going to remain the same, but no longer are you going to have slavery, but you're going to have civil unrest. And again, you have the images. And Frederick Douglass makes a comment about Abraham Lincoln and the statue of the Emancipation, which you can see in different places, D.C. and Boston, where Lincoln is standing over a black male who is on his knees, and Douglass puffs. He says, well, they could have found a more manly image. Douglass was never one to mince words. So the difference in the narratives that we're going to be seeing is it's less about individuals and more about the social and not acknowledged shift away from the persons who threaten power, Bacon, Turner, Douglass, all men, to the structures of power under threat. 1870 to 1967, what I'm calling I don't use the word segregation, I call it apartheid. Segregation, you can say, well, it's just segregation. It's not. It's legally apartheid. These are laws in place. And one can do one's own homework on this and see how this works. This just isn't someone telling somebody else to get off the stairs because a white person is coming along. This is the law. This isn't someone simply saying, oh no, you use this water faucet, or you can use any department in our department store, but you can't use the department that's the lunchroom. What? How do we get this? So racial violence, now here again, you begin to see it. In the Reconstruction period, it took three forms: urban riots, interpersonal fights, organized vigilante groups. What they're not telling you is that all of these are white. You can find your narratives on this. Colfax riot. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. Now, it takes a point to, it marks the end of a carpetbag misrule in the South. Sometime look up the Colfax, and it's an astonishing thing that happened, that legal authority was involved in all of this. 2 of these were removing legitimate authority. The Wilmington insurrection, and this is white people insurrecting, not black. Okay. Wilmington massacre, Wilmington coup. The massacre here is of the legally elected black establishment of the city. Okay? And the White Declaration, this is in 1896, 2005, Wilmington came out with a 500-page document, apology and an interview, not interview, but an investigation of this. And again, all these information, while unnecessarily contained by a few more minutes, you can find references to this. White segregation, the Caucasian, White Declaration of Independence. We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled of men of African origin. Actually, they're American. They're not African anymore. Frederick Douglass was called into the group of black leaders were called into the White House, and Lincoln was proposing colonization to Liberia, which is where that particular country came from. And they said, "But why would you send us to Liberia? This is our country. We live here. We've lived here for generations." About which Lincoln, who was a kind of a liberal of his own particular period, he was no better or worse on these issues than any other person. He had nothing to say to that. This is from the Declaration of White. North Carolina is a white man's state, and white men will rule it. Now, women, we don't know. And they will crush the party of Negro domination beneath a majority so overwhelming. By the way, do we want to talk about voter registration and these kinds of laws now? That no other party will ever dare to attempt to extinguish or establish Negro rule here. Right out of the Gothic. Right out of the Gothic. Here's your sentiment. Here's your Gothic. Not to be outdone, 1901, Alabama. This is the headlines of the newspaper. The citizens of Alabama declare for white supremacy and purity of ballot. There's that code word. It's like violence. Purity is also a moving context, a moving kind of symbol, and it's usually applied to endangered femininity. The Constitution Convention in 1901 was called with the intention by Democrats of the state, quote, within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in the state. This is still happening, by the way. There are still elements of this as late as 2019. They are still trying to eliminate some of the language from the Constitution. What we call the lost cause. Southern Poverty Review says that the first period of the Confederate narrative was between 1880 and 1900. That's interesting. This is now 15, 20 years beyond the war between the states, the Civil War. But it's also the period of what we call the Jim Crow. I don't like the expression Jim Crow because it basically hides the whites-only legal apparatus apartheid for white segregation, which is a mouthful, but that's what Jim Crow was. These are laws. This is not just what I feel about this. So this is kind of the first time you see the Confederate narrative, where white becomes the unmarked center of the new narrative arc. I teach this in my class. 1905, historical romance, and we know the terms again. But notice now you're beginning to see that this particular edition has a loop to Griffin's Birth of a Nation, so that even the texts begin to feed on themselves. And we know that Birth of a Nation, if you saw the film, has Woodrow Wilson, that white supremacist who gets a bridge in D.C. And a stopway on 95, who segregated Washington, D.C. And he says, well, the Ku Klux Klan was only doing what it had to do for the white people to survive. This is the President of the United States. Southern Law Review, the two periods in which Confederate markers went up, 1890 through 1920, quote, Jim Crow apartheid, the era of lynching. Then here most recently, 1960 through 1970, the SPLC has this kind of odd statistic that Confederate markers, monuments, spread over 31 states, although there were only 11 Confederate states that seceded. So we're not going to be able to finish everything here that we're doing, but we're going to, I was going to say manfully, personally move ahead. My politic in all of this, And so when I will apologize in a sense for shorthanding some things. My questions are about my own self and my culture, but why we rubberneck, why there's something around violence as a public grammar, even back to Edgar Allan Poe, and that as an American studies person myself, and having sat through any number of stories around the Scarlet Letter, and Hawthorne is basically talking about an enslaved narrative in which the crime in old Britain for enslavement, adultery, was the letter A blazoned on your chest. Okay. So the Scarlet Letter, which what's her name, Hester puts on her dress, he's gentlifying it for the reader. But in all of the American texts, and this is what grammar is, what the book we're talking about before, there's a disconnection here in American politics and looking about where violence comes from. How does it produce coherence? How do we use this? How do these cultural products, whether they're CNN or the New York Times or this kind of a leering view onto the next slave document, what do we do with that? That these texts might be problematic at production, like who would write this stuff? But it's also problematic at consumption. Who would view this stuff? Henry Giraud, a wonderful book on reading photography. Okay, disturbing pleasures. They're pleasures, but there's a funny quality to it. They're an index of social anxieties and disconnects, and they explore in varieties of ways the rebellion narratives. Violence is embedded in the various approved structures of society. In all these, and we don't have time, if we had a 10-semester course, we could do this. The questions concerning self-defense, and we go to Trayvon Martin, to Floyd, to Garner, the vengeance, justified violence, myths of masculine valor, female victimization. So we keep reenacting this repression of the slave, which permits a kind of transgression of social taboos without the necessary consequences. We can keep talking about those people, okay, without having to do anything about that work. So the presentist mode, we can continue talking about the enslaved and enslavement, and we can beat our breast and say, oh, how bad it all was. But do something now about this? We'd rather read about it safely in the past. A specific particular image. 1919, the year of racial violence. This was the result of a white mob. More than 250 Americans were killed in at least 25 riots across the US by white mobs that never faced punishment. The greatest period of interracial strife the nation has ever witnessed. And again, it prettifies the language. In a span of 10 months, these are, now sorry to say it this way, white people doing this. And they're not brought to law. And even in the representations of this, you don't see this. You see press, police, victim, the apparatus of the government that this put together. It's probably useful to, if you want to just pick up violence in the United States, race violence in the United States, and read it. In 1919 alone, erupted in such places as New York, Memphis, Tennessee, Philadelphia, Charleston, all these northern places, southern places, South Carolina, Baltimore, New Orleans, Wilmington, Delaware, Omaha, Nebraska, New London, Connecticut, Bisbee, Arizona, Longview, Texas, Knoxville, Tennessee. Why do we read stuff like this? Why does it happen? What's the readerly contract here? How here? Because here we're not talking now about the social dynamic out on the street. We're talking about the social dynamic that had a lot of us here this morning, CNN and New York Times, and the constant essence of, and I taught a course on Gothic literature. I can't stand to watch Gothic films. How can I teach about it? So the questions I'm asking here are my own questions. Is how do my own affects swirl unclarified in a discourse? How do we as a culture have some kind of investment in maintaining the public awareness of these, And how is violence then used as a denomination that we can attach to these other kinds of people? So the text, formal from postcards to news media, problematic at consumption, but production too. Okay, and nowhere is this kind of a media loop, and we'll see this as we go here, more clear than in the looped media and public performance of the lynching cycle. And I'm sure that most of us have no idea what to think about this until we ask ourselves, is there any kind of a contemporary equivalent? It's easy to be mournful about the 4,000 people, unnamed persons who were lynched by unnamed persons by the New York Times from 1890, or Ida Bell, Ida Bell's Red Year. But nowhere is it clearer than in the looped media. The lynching follows, one, the breathless announcement of time and place. Days in advance. Indiana mob of 10,000 people beats, lynches a man and beats the wrong man. 10,000. Negro seized by Florida mob. 2 more Negroes. Then you have the sentiment. Negroes plan to kill all whites. This particular headline was 3 days in advance. They announced this. So they are operatic. It becomes a kind of a porn. Excite me, titillate me, but don't show me how. I look at this, I go, is there a contemporary equivalent of this? What do I do with the Trevor Martin? What do I do with the Gardner? What do I do with Ferguson? What do I do with Floyd? What do I do with the next time it happens down the street? What do I do when people say, oh, well, no, but reparations, they're no longer enslaved? So at a text level, this is a grammar of affect that fetishizes and displays while hiding a certain kind of content. And it is operatic because we can put them into visible and social symbolic play, discordant images of culture, which for various reasons are not amenable to change. And it's hard to know how to handle a paralegal but socially sanctioned event. Okay, 1919. This was announced. Okay, it's like a greeting card. Racial terrorism, a historical investigation of lynching. Again, all the terms that we use, victims of lynching, it never talks about the white people. I would bet you that if you started changing the titles to say, like, kind of the thing on cigarettes, caution, this is about how white people, or how whatever other expression you want to use, I think things might particularly change. But as a matter of fact, this is very much like the textual equivalent of the passive voice. Nobody is blamed, nobody's blamed, nobody's blamed. It simply raises it up, raises it up, raises it up. Okay. Lovecraft Country, the self-conscious literary looping that we have been seeing through all of this. And the genres offer connections of how to read. The CNN, I'm still astonished to see that. Were you there? Send us your images. Okay. Here you have the levels of this. Don't shoot. She's being photographed. So there's a representation within a representation. The police are watching this. This is Lovecraft Country, and if you've never seen it, one of my earliest publications was in Lovecraft, and I only say that because much of the quote gothic, monster horror in this is Lovecraft. There's no question about it. Was Lovecraft racist? Read Red Hook, for example, in which he starts talking about. I can't even use particular language. But he was very much a racist white guy, and so his monsters, while they themselves were not necessarily meant to be in any kind of race way. So Lovecraft Country has kind of the polar between the booga booga monsters on the one hand and the killing of Emmett Till, or the reference to Emmett Till, or the reference to the Green Book, or the reference to things that were happening. So in Lovecraft Country, there's a remark about the park where these folks are buying a house, and the park was the park of Red Summer in Chicago. So if one knows one's history, Lovecraft Country would be a walking tour through the period of the 40s and the 50s. My point here is that we're no longer reading anything that is a new thing. It's a constant reminder and a repetition and a re-envision and a reconfirmation of a kind of culture. Washington, D.C., 1968. The days after that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. Robert Kennedy, a few days, a few months, even maybe a few weeks before his own killing. Washington, D.C. An aside, I walked into Washington, D.C. To teach at Georgetown in 1986, and I was so astonished at the part of town that I was in. I said, this is the country, the capital of the country. It's better, possibly now, but as a matter of fact, Washington, D.C. was enslaved for a reason. And the fact that we were still taxation without representation, there was still an enslavement going on in the city that has to do with legal politics, and it's not just about whether we get to have a flag. It's about population. It's about this man's family bought a race covenant house in Georgetown. And you can say, well, he had to sign the covenant or he couldn't buy the house. Well, John Kennedy could have done that. That's true. Okay. The Washington Post comes back and talks about the deadly race riot aided and abetted by the Washington Post. In other words, this was a headline in the Washington Post itself. You can see Georgetown over in the background. Scores heard as racist battle in streets of Washington. Again, what's completely eviscerated here is the context of this. Negro fiend pursued by 1,000 posse. Riots sweep Chicago. For many of us, the only time we know this now is because they are being brought back into film. 75 blacks die in race war. It's not race war. It was not a race war. It was a group of white, I'll say European Americans who came in and devastated a 35 square block. Okay? 8,000 Tulsa Negroes seek, what do you call it, home. During the Tulsa massacre, white mob attacked residents, homes, and businesses. And they keep referring to this as kind of the Black Wall Street. And I don't get the sense of why they have to keep putting that particular word in to somehow justify or make the effects worse. By the way, Tulsa has never acknowledged this. So the wink to the reader here, moving along, not so hidden, self-secret. This isn't biology as much as it's social definition that we're talking about through over here. John Lewis, may he rest in peace. Enslavement as legal is ended, but the narrative positioning continues. The genre we're looking at stabilizes an American history based on violence and dominance. What's the subject here? Whose pleasure is this? And the readerly relay, the back and forth between the sentiment and the Gothic. 450 Negro children. Remember, we already talked about whenever you see children involved, there is an appeal to a kind of a response of empathy. So you go from this. We expect, and we understood this, and we had a certain kind of reader response to this. So the final movement of the genre is elegy and memorial, ends the narrative cycle. So we can now memorialize this awful moment. And the fact that they have the poor creature involved in it is, so to kind of capture up what I've been trying, every culture has ways of producing a certain kind of meaning, and the United States is not finished. It's an unfinished business, really. It's like going to see a psychiatrist. The unfinished business is kind of our own sense of ourselves as a country with with the compromise that was made in the Constitution that was really not a compromise. And we still have not gotten beyond that particular, because enslavement started before that, and it's going to continue before that. But so a culture already is an operatic movement that amounts as disconnects and crises, but which nothing is changed. So we're moving away from the actual history event to something that's a satisfying textual ending. And very quickly, the complications of the moral gaze. As we've seen throughout, the focus on individuals and the struggle for freedom and civil rights keeps a view off the local legal and civic structure. This is very similar to the image of Clinton in 1998. But the point is, it's how we read it. I would like to know what the picture was that they had taken this out of. We like Dr. King because he says nice things. We shall overcome because the arc of the universe is long but it bends towards justice. We like him because he says things like, we have a dream. We like him because he does nothing, gets arrested for vagrancy. We don't like him when he says, as he says in 1963, why we can't wait. We are the only country that has established genocide as a fundamental federal principle. He said it. He said it about the indigenous Americans, and 40 years before the United Nations ever talked about that particular point. We don't like King when he started talking about the other America. You don't ever see that listed in his texts. So the sentiment of Martin Luther King's work is against odds about Supreme Court law, local law, social protocols, and it's also not true. When states were told in 1957 to segregate, Virginia closes its public schools. Reparations were finally voted in 2004. Martin Luther King's caisson at his death. You'll notice the mules. Done for a reason. It's got an eye to the camera. What's also interesting is the way this played in Europe. This is from The Guardian. 4 million, a 4-mile line long of over 200,000 people, 63 years ago. This is also 60 years ago. This was also the same number of people that he spoke before at the Lincoln in 1963. So we've seen this, and the point that I'm going to end with is that we kind of like these images. We kind of like Westworld, and there's Battlestar Galactica here, and there's Blade Runner. But as long as they involve robots, which is a Czech word, which means slave, by the way, as long as these kinds of films, Terminator and Blade Runner and Robot and Ghost and Shell, The Matrix, Saturn, Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, as long as they're involving robots, we're really keen on them. We really like them. I'm going to end here. I'm going to try and do this quickly. And I guess what I'm trying to say is to exchange agency for eulogy. And we've seen this. You can see all these particular images, how they loop up in Common in John Lynch. When it goes down, we women and men up. They say stand down, and we stand up. Shots we in the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. The uncanny look of the camera that focuses, that itself is the genre, that this young child even knows that. Yeah. If one is interested, one could look up the Brennan Report on police violence. It's astonishing. These are the names. Martin, Brown, Ferguson. This is 53 years before George Floyd. This is an elderly woman in Selma. What have we learned? We learned that clearly this kind of images sell. We keep watching them. To repeat what I started with, the denunciation of slavery in a presentist mode is easy. What needs to be denounced here to restore authenticity is much less slavery than the racist present within which representations of slavery are produced. Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Power and violence are opposites, where one rules absolutely, the other is absolutely absent. Um, Coming back to structure, the UN in 2016, structural racism endures in the US and the government has failed to protect African Americans' rights. You may recall, well, why Trump was moving away from the United Nations, well, it was because of this report. It's an interesting report. You'll find very few, not even the New York Times covers it, really. You have to really dig to get it. The word finally that I'll question is power, because power too is part of the malist expression. It's like it's all men. Men's power. Is there another way to think about this? Is there another? So the questions that I am left for this is, if we did not have this genre, what would we have in its place? We can have Battlestar Galactica. My husband and I watch it constantly. And Westworld got a little self-referential. We didn't quite know what to think about that. But there is something about the sentimental and the Gothic that returns to us. So the thing that I will end, that culture is a palimpsest. Every image builds on an image before. There's not a new image, but every image will then add to what went before and bring to a conclusion, possibly, only until the next image. And the important part is being able to read. And to read the culture is to be able to look at these images and say, what is the politic? Who's doing it? Who made it? And why'd they make it? I want to thank everyone for taking the time this afternoon to be with me and us. And as Robert will know, that if you ever need to get a hold of me, if you would like to have a conversation about the bibliography, if you want references as to which of where this material comes from, as an educator who teaches European ethics, I will say, and I tell this every time I teach this course to the school, keep the statues perhaps, put them in a museum, but get rid of the European continental ethics. It's not good. It's not good for us as the United States. And why still, 200 years later, we're still trying to ape our, quote, intellectual betters, I don't know. Thank you. Good afternoon. Robert, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that. So if you have any questions for Edward, feel free to type them in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom or the comment section in Facebook, and we'll pass as many of those along as we can. Ed, we did have a few.
I see that Miss Matten has been very engaged, and I thank you for that. So maybe Robert wants to share one of her questions.
Oh yeah, yep, just one second. Let's see, I was keeping a track from some of the earlier ones. So Anita asked a question, why do you say enslavement versus slavery? That's a question that...
Because it's like talking about the homeless. We keep talking about the homeless, the homeless, the homeless. The homeless is a category. A homeless person is a person.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that something that's come up in the past few years. You didn't hear that as often, that term as often a few years ago. So nice to see people shifting over that. Here's an interesting question from Linda. She says, I'm a lawyer. I get juries to give reparations, and then in brackets, damages, by showing pictures of the harm. How do we make a case for reparations for slavery without showing these horrifying pictures? People are very visual.
Well, she's addressing the point that I make. That reading Hegel, Master Slave, is hard, but looking at pictures is easy. I have a great deal of sympathy for Counselor, and I will say that I have that same kind of issue here. That any image that I would use, and you know, Robert, that I do this thing on reparations, and we're talking about images, that any image that I use, the camera is largely always white. And how to avoid that, not that the camera, not that I'm a white guy, I'm saying this, but is there a way to get to an agency that is non-colonial, non-European? There's some dismantling that has to happen.
Okay, no problem. And let's see, here's a question from Renee. This is interesting. Do you see a correlation of post-1918 pandemic resulting in 1919 Red Summer violence to what's happening now in COVID and then in 2021?
There's a book for you. I will say,
yeah, that could be a PhD dissertation right there.
I've read any number of books on what they call the Spanish influenza. What's interesting is that it was never talked about at the time. The war was fought with this, And so, what you never see, that much of the violence in 1919 were men coming back, veterans, mostly men, coming back into the States in the same way it happened in the 40s. But that in all these narratives about veterans trying to come back and find their own particular jobs, never did you see any word about illness or the disease or any of these other sorts of things. But it all became nor about the economics, nor about the war. That Red Summer could have simply happened in any particular place, and it was about a kid swimming. So there was never a deep backstory to any of this. I trust me. I've tried finding one or two. Now you'll begin to find one. There's actually a story now on Emmett Till, who was murdered. Was it 56 years ago? Yesterday, and you begin to see the back narrative, which is completely different than the public narrative. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean,
And then
I think the connection is important. That the civic unrest, social unrest, is not about race. Why we put it about race is because we know how that plays out as a genre. We don't know how disease plays out as a genre unless you read your Susan Sontag. We don't know how the wars played out. We don't know how the economics played out. We don't have the language for that. We, as the counselor said a moment ago, we're visual. We just need, show me your images.
okay. And then this was a comment from Jennifer, and I'll echo her thought. She was talking about, it was really interesting about your Hollywood and correlation of, slave revolts from African American, maybe not as good, but if they're robots, that's fine. That's interesting. We all like to watch those. So that was a really interesting angle on that. Appreciate that. And then someone asked this, okay, actually a couple people kind of asked similar questions or made similar comments. What about Native Americans or American Indians and their events and activities, like say the Battle of Little Bighorn, in comparison and contrast with like slave results?
Well, I will tell you, wait for my next one, extermination. And I'm going to be doing one of these just on that. I mean, my point with 1619, not to keep repeating myself, but my point with those dates, the complete erasure from this argument around the indigenous nations and their enslavement and American genocide by federal policy. That's not, there's no other way of putting it. Andrew Jackson, Amherst, Jeffrey Amherst, who gives us Amherst College, he was the one who threw smallpox blankets into the camps to kill them, to clean out. Mm-hmm. Declaration of Independence talks about the savages on our borders. Well, we're pushing them out. So, I couldn't talk a lot about them here, but the thing early on with the slavery narratives or the captivity narratives, you see one or two of those are images with Native Americans, and that's where it started here. That Mary Rowlandson was one of the very first indigenous nation women.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about the future programs. So this is one of a series, and we went through earlier the previous ones you did. Did you want to take a moment and maybe talk about what's going to be happening moving forward?
I have one, which is that coming up as the exterminate them, which is George Washington's language for the indigenous nations. Then there's one that's simply called white, the apparatus of social practices and laws of white apartheid, white ethno nation. And Robert, you have those, but there are a couple coming forward. And you can post those, but there are two or three that are still in the mix, one of them which is the indigenous nations and the formation of what I would call the white ethno state. Because I'm very serious that it's not black segregation we're talking about, it's white segregation.
Right, okay. All right, let's see. Well, we've been going on for a couple hours, so why don't we do this? We'll wrap things up. So if you're joining us, I'll send out the information for the next program. Edward and I are working on the date for that. We'll probably have that in the next, I would imagine, day or two, and I'll be happy to email that out. So thanks to all of you for joining us and your interest on this very educational topic. And Edward, of course, thanks all goes to you for putting this presentation together and getting us up to speed on some of these topics and issues that I don't know how else people would get like an education on these types of things. So
Robert, can I make one last point?
Oh yeah, sure. Yes, please do.
Some may or may not know that I have a parallel program. It's called Reparations, a Call Out, and it's simply reading of significant texts. We're doing one on the indigenous and Columbus in October. We're continuing with H.R. 40, King and Sherman's 40 Acres of Mule. on September 12th. So if you have some yearning to know more about the texts and the background and the deeper stories behind some of the reparation moves, please join us.
Oh yeah, and I'll send that information out as well. So okay, Edward, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
I want to thank you, Robert, for being very patient.
Oh no, Edward,
I want to
the
thank
thanks is all mine.
I want to thank my puppies for once listening quietly to me, not arguing.
They were a cooperative audience. So, well, thanks everyone. Stay safe. We will see you soon. Have a great rest of your weekend. Again, we'll email out the information on the future programs, and we'll hope to see you back here next time. Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.
Peace to everyone. Good night to you. Goodbye.